Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name is Brina and today is Didn't Make Up the Mystery Saturday. This series is where I sit down, play with makeup, and we talk about true crime. So far that's all we've really talked about. I really want to get into some other stuff. I just don't know where to start yet. So if you have any suggestions about things that aren't necessarily true crime but are a mystery of sorts, then leave them in the comments below. And with that being said, let's get into today's story because I have a feeling it's gonna be a long one and there's gonna be a lot going on. So buckle up, Buttercup, and let's get to it. Today's story is one of two brothers, both of whom are tied to Yosemite National Park in very different ways. One brother will come out a hero, the other a monster. So we're gonna start in 1972 in Merced, California. This is where the Stayner family lives. The Stayner family consists of Delbert and Kay, who are happily married with, I believe they only had 4 children at this time, but eventually they had 5. They had 2 sons, Cary, who was the oldest child, and Stephen, who was the 3rd child. They also had 3 daughters, Cynthia, Corey, and Jody. Merced is known as a small farming town. It's surrounded by almond and peach groves, and it's often referred to the gateway of Yosemite because it is only about an hour and a half outside of the park. Now, Cary and Stephen were actually pretty close despite their 4-year age gap. Cary actually played with Stephen. He would look out for him, and the two just generally hung out together, which I think is very rare for 2 siblings, especially when they have that much of an age gap. Their father, Delbert, worked as a mechanic at a peach cannery, and their mother, Kay, was often described as aloof. She was just very cold and distant, and that was pretty much how everyone thought she raised her children. She was just more on the cold side towards them, not super loving, and Cary was always described as a quiet and nice guy. So that's what's going on with the Stayner family. Meanwhile, around Yosemite lives a man by the name of Kenneth Parnell. Kenneth was a convicted sex offender who was raised mostly by his mother after his father abandoned the family when he was only 6 years old. He spent much of his childhood in and out of mental institutions and juvie. Then in March of 1951, he was arrested for sodomizing a young boy and impersonating a police officer. So that is where his convicted. He was then sentenced to 4 years in prison, and he claims to have been married 3 times, but there's only records of 2 of his marriages. In 1950, he married his first wife, and the two had a daughter together in 1951. They ended up divorcing in 1957, and that same year he married his second wife, and they also had a daughter together. While he was in prison, his second wife divorced him. By 1972, he had found work at a lodge in Yosemite. Then on December 4th, 1972, Stephen Stayner was walking home from school. It was a very sleety, wintry day, and he only made it about 4 blocks before he was approached by a man named Irvin Murphy. Now, Irvin was a co-worker of Kenneth Parnell's. He's been described as a trusting, naive, simple-minded man. In other words, he just wasn't the brightest. So Ken had filled Marvin with this idea of setting out to find a boy who Ken could raise as his own and in a God-fearing religious sort of way. He told Irvin he just did not like how children in the 70s were being raised, and he thought they needed more religion in their lives, and Irvin agreed, so he agreed to help Ken with his little mission. Irvin had some religious tacts that he'd been carrying around and trying to talk to children using the religious aspect as bait, basically. And when he approached Stephen, he asked him if he thought maybe his mom would be willing to give a donation to the church. Stephen replied, yeah, she probably would. And at that point, Ken drove up in his white Buick, and Irvin opened the back door. Stephen got in willingly, and then the three of them headed off towards what Stephen thought was his home. But instead of taking a right to go towards the Stayner residence, Ken kept driving east on Highway 140 towards Yosemite. After a good little while of driving, Ken stopped the car and went to a payphone. He then came back and told Stephen, "Your parents, I just spoke to them. They no longer want you. You're gonna be my son." Then Ken drove them to his cabin in Kathy's Valley, but unbeknownst to Stephen, the cabin was located only a few hundred feet from his grandfather's house. After successfully abducting Stephen, Ken uses cough syrup to keep him sedated for the first few weeks that he is at his home. Basically, he thinks that if he keeps him sedated and just keeps feeding him these lies, he's telling him, "I've adopted you and your parents don't want you. They had too many children. They can't take care of all you, and you're the one that they chose to give up." So he's hoping that if he keeps feeding him these lies and filling him full of cough syrup, maybe Stephen will begin to forget about his old life and start believing the lies that Kenneth is telling him. Stephen's first night with Kenneth, he was molested. Then about 13 days later, the raping began. During these early days, Stephen repeatedly told Kenneth that he wanted to go home, and Ken informed Stephen that he had gained legal custody of him, which was obviously a lie. Kenneth then began calling Stephen Dennis Parnell, and he told him, "This is your new name." On December 4th, when Stephen didn't make it home from school, his parents were immediately concerned and they alerted police, and a big search began for Stephen, but they were not able to find anything. He just was gone. Stephen's disappearance crushed his father Delbert. His mother Kay became even more distant and cold towards her four remaining children. This left their oldest son Cary feeling not only upset and distraught over his brother's disappearance, but he also felt neglected by his parents. Then a few weeks after Ken had abducted Stephen and he went through his whole brainwashing thing, they began moving around California. I'm guessing Ken just was trying his hardest to keep Stephen segregated and isolated and keep him from knowing where he was so that way he would not be able to ask for help, because if they stayed in one place for too long, maybe he would get used to his surroundings and start to catch on to Ken's routines. Not only did they move around, but Ken was constantly changing jobs, and it seems as though Ken's brainwashing has really truly worked on Stephen, because there were times where he would work jobs where he would be required to travel, and he would just leave Stephen home alone during these times. So many people wonder why Stephen didn't take those opportunities to run or get help, and it's really just Stephen was 7 when he was abducted. He believed what he was told. He was told by this man that I'm your father now, and that's just how it is. He had developed some sort of parental bond towards Ken. I mean, during the day he would act as his father, and at night he would do unspeakable things to him, but Stephen relied on Ken for clothes and food, and he later would admit that he just did not know how to get help, and that's why he never left. So about 4 years after Stephen's abduction, it is now 1976, Stephen and Kenneth are now living in Cary, California. It is a tiny little town, and basically, it's a good place to hide. Ken enrolls Stephen in school, and since there was no school in Cary, Stephen actually had to travel 30 minutes by bus every day to and from school. So Ken obviously trusts him because he's gone from Ken's site about 10 hours a day. So if he really wanted to, he could just leave. Ken knows that, but he trusts that he has brainwashed Stephen enough that he won't just leave. By his freshman year of high school, Stephen began to get involved in sports, and overall he was a very popular kid. I mean, he got himself a girlfriend, plus Ken was a very lenient father, so he really allowed Stephen to come and go as he pleased at this point. He let him smoke cigarettes, he let him drink alcohol. Stephen really was kind of living the life life. At least that's what most teenagers would think. Once again, people would later wonder why Stephen didn't just leave during this period of time. But by now, Stephen really isn't even positive what his real name is, and he relies on Kenneth for food and clothing and a roof over his head. But deep down, Stephen knows he still has a real family out there somewhere, and one day while him and his girlfriend were walking around day drinking, he broke down and told her that he wanted to go home to his real family. She just chalked it up to he was drunk, and they never talked about it again. Back in Merced, his older brother Cary is finishing up his last little bit of high school, and he is known as the kid whose brother was kidnapped. He was voted most creative by his classmates, and he was a very talented cartoonist. So it might seem like Cary is doing all right emotionally, but the reality is that he's just not. He is always seen wearing a hat, but it's not like he's trying to make some kind of a fashion statement or anything. It's actually quite the opposite. Cary has been pulling his hair out due to stress, and he's wearing the hat to cover up the fact that it looks like he's going bald. Unlike his brother Stephen, Cary never had a girlfriend. It just seemed like he didn't know how to act around women, and he began acting extremely erratically around them. At one point, he even flashed one of his sister's friends. He was just desperate for this love and affection from a girl, but he didn't know how to get it. So people began kind of seeing him as a creepy dude. He was just always extremely inappropriate with women. But Stephen, who has been objected to this unspeakable horror for all these years, is flourishing. So it's just strange, this contrast that we have going on with these two brothers. You think it would be the other way around, right? On one hand, you have this brother who has been abducted and exposed to these unspeakable horrors, but yet he's a happy-go-lucky kid who is flourishing in high school. He's popular. He's got a girlfriend. And then you have Cary, the other brother, who is left at home and is a creepy loner. By 1979, Ken has moved Stephen to a new remote location. They're now living in a one-room shack that is very old and in very poor condition. Ken is starting to realize that Stephen is not a little boy anymore, and he's not going to be able to control him anymore. So he set out on a mission to find a new boy he could use to replace Stephen. Ken had previously tried to use Stephen as bait to try to abduct another boy to replace Stephen, but all of these attempts had failed. Stephen would later admit that he sabotaged these attempts on purpose because he knew what lied ahead for whatever young boy Ken had set his eyes on, and he did not think that any boy should have to go through what he went through, and he tried his best to prevent that from happening. Ken now believes that Stephen lacked what it took to be Ken's accomplice, so he used one of Stephen's friends, a kid named Randall Portman, to take Stephen's place in the abduction attempts, I guess you could say. He was trying to find somebody to do what Irvin had done for him back in 1972 when he took Stephen. So on February 13th, Randall and Ken set out looking for a young boy, and they ended up kidnapping Timothy White, a 5-year-old boy from Ukiah, California. As soon as Ken brought this boy home, Stephen knew he had to figure out a way to get him out because he just really did not want Timmy to go through the same thing that he did. Timothy was understandably very distraught, and this really pulled at Stephen's heartstrings even more. So after watching Timmy suffer for 2 weeks, Stephen knew he had to do something. On March 1st, when Kenneth went to work, Stephen got the courage to take Timmy, and he knew he was from Ukiah, but Timmy didn't know his address or anything, so Stephen took him to Ukiah. They hitchhiked there. Stephen carried him on his back, and once they they got to the town, not knowing what else to do, not knowing where to take Timmy, he decided to go to a police station. Now, don't forget, Ken has been calling Stephen Dennis for the last 7 years. So when he gets to the police station, police don't immediately know what to think of his story. Police ask for his name and he says, "I know my first name is Stephen." He wrote a written statement saying that he believed his name was Stephen Stayner, but he spelled the last name Stayner wrong, and he said he wasn't sure what his actual birth date was, and he had no clue what his original middle name was. It took police a little while of digging to finally come up with Stephen's missing child poster, and that's when they realized the magnitude of what just walked into the police station. Stephen became a national hero. There was a book written about his story and also a TV movie, both of them titled "I Know My First Name is Stephen." Him and Timmy were both returned to their families, and you would think this would basically be the end of the story, but we're not even close. A few days after Stephen returned home, him and his parents went on Good Morning America, where his mom made it seem like he was just having the best time readjusting to being home. Everything was perfect. He was a well-behaved boy, and she really just made it seem like it was happily ever after, but that is definitely not the case. Stephen had a really hard time. He went to counseling for a brief period of time, but then his father said he didn't need it, so he stopped going and never sought help again. He was struggling with the adjustment of going from being an only child to now having 4 other siblings, as well as all of these rules that were suddenly in place. He wasn't allowed to smoke or drink. He couldn't just come and go as he pleased. His parents were basically treating him like the 7-year-old boy they lost, and it was a very big adjusting period for them to figure out how to handle his return. Meanwhile, Cary is doing worse than ever. He's struggling with his brother's return. I mean, he spent the last 7 years wishing his parents would show him some love, and they just wouldn't. Then Steve comes home and he's the golden child. Everybody's so happy, but that's not an excuse. I mean, everybody would be over the moon if their missing child of 7 years finally came home. And I think that's what Cary didn't really realize. It wasn't about him, but that's what he wanted it to be. He wanted it to be about him, but nothing was ever about him. So Cary was just not handling things well. It was also public knowledge that Stephen was sexually abused by Ken, so he had a really hard time at school. Kids are cruel, man. Kids are cruel. He became the target of unrelenting bullying just for the pure fact that he was raped. I mean, what is wrong with people? People were constantly questioning his sexuality. While the adults were calling him a hero, the kids were picking on him, and he still has to face Kenneth Parnell again. They still haven't gone to court. I hope you're enjoying Tiger's show back here. Apparently, he really wants to be on camera today. Ken faced charges of kidnapping and unlawful imprisonment, but no sexual assault charges were ever filed in this case, just because there wasn't enough evidence, supposedly, for this. And sadly, Ken ended up only receiving 7 years in prison. So he took Stephen for 7 years. He only got 7 years. I don't think that seems fair at all. And icing on the cake, he only ended up serving 5 of those 7 years. So he actually spent less time behind bars than Stephen spent under his torture. Now, you remember Irvin Murphy, the guy that was Ken's accomplice in abducting Stephen? Well, he was also charged in the case. He received a 5-year sentence for his part, and he was paroled after 2. And then Randall Poorman, the friend of Stephen's who had helped with abducting Timmy, was sentenced to a term in a juvenile work camp. But this is not where Kenneth's story ends. We're not really going to go into detail on that because, once again, that's not what today's story is about. But in 2003, Kenneth is now 71 years old. He is suffering from a number of health problems. He required near 24-hour-a-day nursing care. He had diabetes and emphysema, and he had also had a stroke a few years prior, so he was also suffering from the aftermath of that. But none of that stopped him from still trying to find another another boy to replace Stephen. He had been trying to coerce his caregiver into buying him a 4-year-old boy. She was aware of his past criminal history, so she alerted police immediately, and they set up a sting operation that she cooperated with, leading to his arrest. On February 9th, 2004, he was convicted on the charges of attempting to purchase a child and attempted child molestation. He was sentenced to 25 years to life under the California 3 strikes law, which I'm kind of confused by, because if he had been arrested prior to the Stayner and Timmy White case for sodomizing a young boy, why did this 3 strikes law not apply during the Stephen Stayner and Timothy White case? Unless that wasn't a law they had in place back then, but I don't know. This part confused me. Let me know in the comments if you have any information on that, if you would know why it didn't apply during the other instance, but it does now, because technically this would be his 4th strike, so I'm just confused by that. In 2008, Kenneth Parnell died in prison of natural causes. And folks, this is still not the end of our story. So like I mentioned, Cary, Stephen's older brother, was really struggling after Stephen's return. I mean, he really just struggled his whole life, let's be real here. After he graduated high school, he really didn't know what path he wanted to go down. He had no sense of direction. He just didn't know who he was, and he turned to Yosemite National Park to take refuge, which I find ironic because for most of the 7 years that Stephen was held captive, I'm putting captive in air quotes because for a lot of those years he really was free to go but didn't know where to go, you know what I mean? But Stephen was very close to Yosemite for the majority of his time with Ken. So I find it very ironic that this is the place that Cary turned to find comfort. It's just weird to me. He would often disappear in the forest for days, just getting high, and he also very much enjoyed being naked, and this was a great place to do that. So he just liked being high and being one with nature, so whatever floats his boat. Then one day, Cary thought he saw Bigfoot. If you thought this story couldn't get any weirder, now we're introducing Bigfoot. So if you believe in Bigfoot, sorry, but it's not real. He was absolutely convinced that he had seen Bigfoot. This incident made a huge impact on his life. Any and every person he ever met, he told this story about seeing Bigfoot to. I mean, every person he ever met, he told this story to. He was obsessed with Bigfoot, and he was obsessed with finding Bigfoot again. So back to Stephen, he turned to alcohol, and eventually he was kicked out of the family home. His relationship with his father, Delbert, was in a very rough place, and I'm not sure that they ever made things better between the two of them, although I really hope for their sake that they did. So like I mentioned, there was a book and a movie made about Stephen's kidnapping and subsequent return home, and he did make quite a bit of money off of this. He even had a role in the movie where he played the role of one of the cops when he was being returned home. But he blew through the money that he got from the movie really fast, and he just ended up working menial jobs. In 1985, he married Jody Edmondson. They had 2 children together, but it seems like Stephen had maybe started to turn his life around. He began working with child abduction groups. He spoke to children about personal safety, and he gave many interviews about his kidnapping. Then tragically on September 16th, 1989, Stephen is now 24 years old, and he is riding his motorcycle home from work when he was hit by another vehicle. The motorcycle flipped and he received fatal head injuries. His funeral was attended by 500 people, and Timothy White was a pallbearer. Sadly, Timothy White also lived a short life at the age of 35. He died from a blood clot to the lung. I can't even begin to imagine how difficult it was for the Stayners to deal with Stephen's sudden death. Here is this boy who was missing for 7 years, presumed dead, because let's face it, how often does somebody come home after being gone for that long? They're given another chance with him, and then he is tragically taken away at a very young age. So Cary, who never emotionally dealt with his childhood, is now faced with his brother's death. Then shortly after Stephen dies, their uncle, who lived with Cary and Cary was very close to, was shot and killed in the home that they shared together. So it's just not going well for him. Everything that had happened in his life, he just had buried deep down inside of him. He never sought help for anything, and this rage he had in him began to bubble up shortly after Stephen and their uncle's death. He ended up having a couple of nervous breakdowns, and at one point he told a friend that he felt like jumping in his truck and driving it through the shop where he worked, killing his boss, killing everyone in the office, and then burning the place down. After that, he was taken to a mental facility, but he didn't stay, and once again went to Yosemite to take refuge. This time he moved there. He found work at Cedar Lodge and he lived there as well. But what people around Cary didn't know at this time was that he was having dreams and fantasies about murdering women. So like I said, Cary enjoyed being in the nude. He would often sunbathe in the nude, and he'd be around a multitude of different people, around a bunch of women, and a lot of the people who met him during this time only had good things to say about him. But there was one co-worker who had a teenage daughter. Keep in mind, Cary is in his 30s at this time. Well, Cary had developed a very inappropriate fixation on this co-worker's teenage daughter. So this lady and her husband ran the restaurant at the Cedar Lodge, and them and their daughter lived there. At first they struck up a friendship, which was just inappropriate in itself because Cary is in his 30s. She is a teenager. Then he took it to the next level and began just watching her while she would swim. This started to make her feel uncomfortable. She confided in her mother, who then told Cary, basically, stay away from my daughter or I will hunt you down and I will murder you. I mean, that's the gist of it. That's pretty much what she told him. Sorry for the camera change. Had a camera mishap. By February of 1999, Cary has now been working at the Cedar Lodge for about 2 years, and it is winter. The winters at Yosemite are pretty uneventful usually. I mean, most people don't really go to places like that for a winter vacation. It's very cold there during the winter time, so therefore not a lot of people at the park, not a lot of people staying at the lodge. But there was one small group consisting of 3 women. This small group was made up of Carol Sund, her daughter Julie Sund, and their friend Silvina Peloso, who was visiting from Argentina. The 3 of them were on a trip to look at colleges as well as to enjoy Yosemite. Ignore my cat's tail. They wanted to show Silvina one of the most beautiful places on earth, because despite it being cold at Yosemite in the winter, it is absolutely gorgeous. It's a sight to be seen. They spent the day touring the park, they went ice skating, they just had loads of fun together. And by nightfall, most of the guests visiting Yosemite had returned home, so there really weren't a whole lot of guests staying at Cedar Lodge. The Sons and their friend Silvina were amongst the few who were staying there. They were staying in room 500, which was just about as far from the lobby as you can get, and it was located in a dark corner of the lodge. So now Cary is wandering around the lodge when he approaches room 500. He notices a red Pontiac in front of the door. He sees that the curtains are drawn and he can see clearly inside the room. He sees a woman who he presumes to be a mother and then 2 younger girls, but he did not see a man. So this is when, in his mind, things really start turning. He's been building up this fantasy about killing women. Here are these 3 women. The lodge is basically empty, and he decides that he's going to let all this rage that he's been building up inside of him loose. He's finally going to act on his fantasies. So he knocked on the door. Carol answered. He told her, I'm maintenance, and we have a leak in the room upstairs, so I need to come in and check your room for any leaks. Carol wouldn't let him in, but Cary kept persisting. He kept telling her, look, if I don't do this now, I'm going to have to go to all the other rooms and the leak is going to get worse, and you just need to let me in now so I can do my job. Carol eventually just lets him in, thinking, okay, the man's just here to do his job. Cary goes into the bathroom where he says the leak is. Then he comes back out with a gun. He told them he wanted their money and their car. Then he took Julie and Sylvina into the bathroom, ties them up using duct tape, goes back out, ties Carol up with the duct tape, then he strangled her with rope. He bundled her up and put her in the trunk of her rented car, went back into the room, brought Julie and Sylvina back out from the bathroom, and sexually assaults them. But Sylvina resisted. She was not going to let him do this to her. So he takes her back into the bathroom and strangles her. Then he takes Julie into room 510, the room next door to theirs, and puts her in the bathroom there. He goes back to room 500, takes Sylvina from the bathroom, puts her in the trunk with Carol, goes back into Julie, and by now it's around 5 a.m. and he knows that people are going to start waking up, people are going to start showing up for work. He needs to get out of here. So he tells her, we need to go. He loads her up in the car. Her hands are bound with duct tape in front of her. And the whole time he's telling her he's taking her someplace where he's not going to harm her. And I don't really think Julie knows at this point that her mom and Sylvina are dead. But I'm sure she can only assume they are. Because he placed her in the front seat of the car while the other two were in the trunk. So I don't know that Julie ever actually saw their dead bodies. But he took off driving and he claims he has no idea where he was going or what he was going to do when he gets there, but he ends up about 100 miles away in Sierra Village. At this point, he's gone into like a foresty area, parks the car, takes Julie out of the car, carries her down a pathway, and this is where he slices her throat. He then sets the rented Pontiac on fire. Then he goes and finds a payphone so he can call a taxi to take him back to Cedar Lodge. Once the taxi shows up, he tells his driver that the reason why he needed a taxi, like, he's making a story for himself here. He tells her, oh, I came out here with a bunch of friends and then my friends ditched me. Can you believe that? Like, they left me stranded here with no way to get back. So I had to call a taxi. When they were approaching the valley near Cedar Lodge, Cary pointed out a cabin where he had seen Bigfoot. Like I said, he tells anybody and everybody who will listen to him about his Bigfoot encounter. Meanwhile, Yen's son, who is Carol's husband, is waiting at the San Francisco airport for Carol, Julie, and Sylvina to show up. But the three women never show. He immediately starts to panic, thinking the roads are icy, maybe they got into a car wreck, maybe they're stranded somewhere, I need to find help for them. So search and rescue teams were deployed to search for these vanished women, and they searched for days and days and days, weeks even, with no results. This ended up being the largest search ever constructed in Yosemite. Police went to Cedar Lodge where they had been staying to interview employees and maybe possible other guests to see if anybody had any idea what had happened to these women. One of the people who police interviewed was a handyman who they described as being very helpful, and this handyman was none other than Cary Stayner. Cary was very calm when talking to police. He told them the story about his brother. He just did not set off any alarm bells for police. He even went as far as opening up all of the rooms for the FBI to search. Then in March, about a month after they had gone missing, they finally got a break in the case. A hiker has now stumbled upon the burnt up Pontiac. Upon a search of the car, they were able to determine that there were remains of two people in the car, but the remains were so badly burned that they had no way of being able to identify them immediately. They ended up finding some unburned debris. The most important thing they found was a camera. They developed the pictures, and once they got the pictures back, they had loads and loads of pictures of Carol, Julie, and Sylvina. They were able to positively identify Carol and Sylvina as being the remains found in the trunk after doing some testing. So now people are thinking maybe Julie is still alive. So they set out yet another search, thinking somebody is holding her somewhere. Either that or she's really badly hurt somewhere. We need to find her. We need to find her immediately. Then in late March, the FBI received a hand-drawn map in the mail. There was a spot marked on the map about 40 miles from where the car was found, and at the top of the map it said, "We had fun with this one." So after getting this map, they take a cadaver dog out to the location, and within about 10 seconds of releasing the dog, they find Julie's body. By the summer of 1999, about 5 months have passed since this horrific incident. No more murders have happened in or around Yosemite, and police believed they had the killers in custody. Yes, I said killers, plural. So people have began returning to Yosemite, going about their normal lives, thinking it's safe there again. The killers that police have arrested are two half-brothers by the names of Eugene Dykes and Michael Larwick. Both of them had violent criminal records, and police thought they perfectly matched the suspects that they were looking for. Meanwhile, Cary is still working and living at the lodge. Nobody suspects a thing. Everybody just thinks he's a normal guy. And he seemingly got away with 3 murders. This is when a 26-year-old woman by the name of Joey Armstrong enters the picture. She is living in a green cabin in Big Meadow, which just so happens to be the same place where Cary believes he saw Bigfoot. So this is a very important place to Cary. He goes here often. Like I said, he's hoping one day maybe he'll see Bigfoot again. So one day, Cary goes driving down this back road that connects from Cedar Lodge to the Green Cabin. He ends up parking not too far from the Green Cabin. There is a little stream that goes by there. He is throwing rocks in the stream, and this is when he notices Joey Armstrong. She is getting ready to go away on a trip with her friends, so she is going in and out of the cabin, loading up her Toyota Tacoma with her belongings, and Cary takes notice. He begins observing her. She apparently did not notice him. So once Cary realizes that Joey seems to be alone, he goes back to his vehicle and grabs his murder bag. He approaches Joey, who is very friendly to him, and he begins telling her about his Bigfoot encounter. Then she turns her back to him, and this is when he pulls out his .22 revolver. When she turns around, she is obviously frightened. He puts the gun to her head and tells her to go inside. He takes her to a back bedroom where he bound and gags her using duct tape. But Joey is not going down without a fight. She is fighting back with everything she has, and Cary is barely able to overcome her. After he gets her subdued, he takes her back out, tosses her in the backseat of his vehicle, and drives off. After a little while of driving, Joey still is not giving up, and she manages to throw herself from the back window of Cary's moving vehicle. She lands on the road, gets up, and starts running. Cary pulls over and goes after her. Eventually, he catches her, and when he does, he slices her throat, decapitating her. When Joey didn't show up to meet her friends, they became very worried and alerted authorities. Police went out and searched the cabin, and they noticed no signs of Joey, but they did notice some signs of a struggle. There was a pair of broken sunglasses and just some other things in disarray. Then one of the detectives notices something bobbing in the river, and at first he just thinks it's a piece of debris, so he goes to check it out further, thinking it could be evidence, and sadly it is Joey's body. Unlike with his first murders, this time Cary left behind loads and loads of evidence. He left behind tire marks, eyewitnesses. Cary is kind of suspecting he might get caught for this one. Witnesses told police that they saw a 1979 blue International Scout parked outside of the cabin. They were able to trace the vehicle back to Cary, but at this point, police are just thinking that he is probably some kind of a witness, and they just want to talk to him. He is not any kind of a suspect in the case thus far. Police just want to talk to him. So they go to Cedar Lodge, ask for Cary, but he's not there. When Cary gets word that police were there looking for him, he packs up all of his things and he flees town. So you remember how I had mentioned that Cary likes to be naked. Well, after he leaves Cedar Lodge, he ends up at Laguna del Sol, a nudist resort in Wilton, California. But while he's on his way there, he's unaware that police have issued a bolo, which is be on the lookout for Cary. It's been all over the news and pretty much everybody has seen it, except for Cary apparently. So when he gets to the resort, he sets up a tent and then he goes to the bar where he strikes up a conversation with a woman. She asks him how he is. He tells her, "Oh, I'm not doing so good. I'm actually getting ready to move up north. I'm just having to leave. I can't be here anymore." Like telling her this story, but like being super evasive about why he has to leave. Little does he know that this woman saw the bolo of him on the news. So after she gets done talking to Cary, she immediately calls authorities. The next day, FBI shows up at the resort. They ask where they can find Cary. Staff directs detectives to a restaurant, telling them he'll be easy to find. He's the only one wearing clothes. Once detectives walk in, Cary sees them. He immediately gives himself up, doesn't ask any questions. He just allows them to handcuff him. He goes with them. They take him to Sacramento for questioning. Once they get there, they order pizza. Because like I said, they did not think that Cary was a suspect. They just thought they were talking to a witness. So the detectives are sitting down with Cary. They're all eating their pizza. They're having a good time. And then Cary starts to make very cryptic statements, like talking about how this is the last meal he's going to have as a free man. And then he tells them he can give them closure, but under one condition. He wants them to provide him with child pornography, and not just like a picture or two. He wants a fat stack of child pornography in order for him to spill his guts about what he knows about Joey Armstrong, because police still just think they're questioning a witness about Joey Armstrong. So at this point, detectives are like, yeah, we'll get that for you. We gotta work on that, but in the meantime, why don't you tell us what you know? Cary goes on to describe in gruesome detail the murder of Joey. After he spilled his guts about Joey, detectives can tell that he's holding something back. So they're pushing him more and more, and this is when they find out that they can't get him the child pornography, and so they're thinking, oh crap, how are we going to get him to confess the rest of this? One of the detectives had struck up a friendship, a rapport with him on the way to Sacramento, so this detective just kept pushing him. He said, "I can tell you feel much better now that you've confessed to what you did to Joey, so just tell me what else is on your chest. Just get it off. Just feel better." So he shocks detectives by confessing to the murders of Carol and Julie Sund and Silvina Peloso. At this point, detectives are like, whoa, I don't think I heard you right. Can you repeat that? Because they think they already have the murderers in jail. And now here is this man willingly confessing. But that's not all Cary has to say. He confesses that at the time that he committed the first 3 murders, he had a girlfriend, and her 2 young daughters were actually his intended victims. He had planned on killing them on February 15th, but his plan was foiled. So he ended up going back to the lodge, and he was very upset that he wasn't able to go through with the murders that night. That pent-up rage was just really needing to get out, and that was the only way he thought he could do it. So he went, soaked in the hot tub for a little bit. He was still really mad, and that's when he went walking around the lodge and spotted Carol and the 2 young girls. Really, it was just unfortunate timing for them. Cary ended up pleading not guilty by reason of insanity. His lawyers claimed that the Stayner family had a long history of sexual abuse and mental illness, which had manifested itself not only in the murders, but also in his OCD, and they also try to explain away his request for child pornography by using this little defense. So basically they're just trying to say he didn't mean any of what he said. He only said those things because of what happened to him in his childhood. At his trial, Dr. Ruro Silva testified that Cary did in fact have OCD. He also had mild autism, and he suffered from paraphilia. But nonetheless, he was found sane and convicted of 4 counts of first-degree murder on August 27th, 2002. Cary then received a death sentence, and to this day, he remains on death row at San Quentin Penitentiary in California. So you might be thinking that maybe if Stephen hadn't been abducted when they were children, maybe Cary wouldn't have turned out so badly. Well, following his arrest and conviction and everything, one of the FBI detectives who was there when he gave his confession went to visit him in prison just to see if there was anything else that Cary wanted to get off his chest, see if maybe he could find out why he did the things that he did. This is when Cary admits to fantasizing about murdering women since he was 7 years old, long before his brother's kidnapping. Then he told the detective that he wanted a movie made about his story too. He wanted the same treatment as his brother. I don't know, this guy sounds pretty crazy to me. Like, he thinks that he's on the same level as his brother, who brought home a kidnapped child, and he himself had been kidnapped and he was able to return himself. His brother was a hero. Cary was just a monster. I personally think that Cary probably would have turned out, maybe not to be a serial killer per se, but he definitely would have turned out bad if the things that happened to Stephen didn't happen to Stephen. I just think Cary was probably not good from the beginning, but that's just my opinion. What do you think? Let me know in the comments with your thoughts on this bizarre story of two very different brothers. Give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button before you go. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you next time. Bye!